today's seminar. Today, we are very honored to have Dr. Hoifung Poon visiting us from Microsoft. Dr. Poon is General Manager at Health Futures in Microsoft Research and also affiliate faculty here at UW Medical School. And he has done a lot of high impact and exciting work at the intersection of AI and health. And one work that really is amazing and really worth highlighting is he's the first, with his collaborators, they are the first to explore large language models and multimodal AI in health applications, producing popular open source foundation models. And his latest publication in Nature features Gigapath, the first pathology foundation model. And he has won many awards and highlighting the significance of his work. And he received his PhD here from UW at the Computer Science and Engineering and specialized in machine learning and NLP. Without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Poon.
Thanks so much, Ting, for the invite and the organization, and already have so much fun today with a lot of you in lunch and afternoon conversation. And as Ting mentioned, I graduated from here, so I really welcome any excuse to come back here, right? So, also, as I walk around the campus, just amazed how many new buildings, right, including the Biost buildings and everything. So really kind of sort of feel really intimate and everything. So as Ting mentioned, sort of like I have been in Microsoft Research for a while, since I graduated from UW and been there for 14 years. What I've been sort of doing is trying to figure out how can we kind of like harness and advance AI, right, to try to help transform kind of like health. So today I would basically tell you a little bit about over the past, over decades of like some of our learning, some of our battle scars, and really love to pick you guys' brain. I would also want to preface that as a machine learning people, I have been actually I think every proper statistician will say that machine learning is a branch of statistics. So it's very excited to be here also to kind of like pick you guys' brain, right? Because a lot of machine learning, actually all those things really come from stats. So, and there are sort of like some of the very different kind of perspective that I think it will be very exciting to think about the modern day Gen AI and what's the implication and what are the growth areas. First up, just to do a sound check. Can everyone hear me okay here and also on the Zoom? And cool. So I love for this to be as interactive as possible. So feel free to just raise my hand and shout and just interrupt me anytime, right? So I will start by kind of motivate a little bit about from the precision health, which I think many of you are familiar with, right? I'm probably most likely preaching to the choir. But most importantly is that given this North Star, what are some of the kind of attack angle we can leverage AI? So I will kind of zoom into sort of this angle about sort of like harnessing real world observational data, right, to portray sort of patient embedding. I will explain what that is. So that's kind of like sort of an exciting agenda, but there is lots of challenges, right? So there is obviously a lot of excitement about Gen AI. Especially last year, everybody want to jump on the bandwagon, right? And this year, people start asking, is it real, right? Are we basically past hype cycles and so forth? So I will kind of like give you a little bit of my own perspective and where are actually the places where Gen AI can already help precision health, right? And where are the growth area that actually need tons of work. So specifically, I would say there are two very kind of important area, which is that one is that there is a lot of non-text modality that actually currently the Gen AI is having a major competency gap, and it's not clear that actually by just keep crawling the public web, you can actually bridge those gap, right? So I will use digital pathology as one prominent example, but there are many other modalities like CT, like, I mean, all the single cell and other genomic that you guys have been working on, right? But then once you start to be able to kind of like get a handle of many of those modality, right? Keep in mind, each modality are trying to tell you something, for example, about a cancer patient, right? But they are telling you the information in a sort of almost like distinct language, right? So then the challenge is that how do you ensure that actually we can enable effective crosstalk, right, among those different modality? How do we combine them? So that's really some major holy grail. And then I will highlight some of the real world application, which I actually find very excited through some of the conversation that lots of people here care about clinical trial, which is actually a beachhead area that we actually are kind of like fixated in. Obviously, a lot of you guys did amazing work in causal inference, and I will highlight one example where we are barely scratching sort of the surface, right, with some baby step, and with you guys probably have a lot more advanced technique that we can borrow. So that's kind of like roughly the plan for, and so I think sort of like it's unquestionable that obviously in the ideal world, we want every patient to be able to respond to the treatment they have been prescribed to, right? So in the graph here on the left-hand side, this appeared in one Nature paper many years ago. You can see that is represented by the blue person, right? So the blue person signifies the patient who respond to the treatment they have been prescribed to. Unfortunately, in the real world, many patients don't respond to the treatment, which is signified by the red person, right? So as you can imagine, this is a huge waste. This is a lot of unnecessary suffering, but most important of all, we basically, that also signifies a giant miss of treatment opportunity. So cancer is really kind of like the poster child for this, right? So early days, this is people dubbed it as a slash poison and burn. You try to kill every dividing cell, and toxicity is high and efficacy is low. Then came the second gen, which is the targeted therapy, right? So first, apology a little bit about the imagery here, but on the left-hand side, you got a late-stage melanoma patient, nothing worked, right? But by figuring out that actually this cancer is driven by this BRAF mutation, and then specifically devise a small molecule, right, to target that mutant protein domain, right? Almost like a guided missile, right? Instead of carpet bombing. So miraculously, you saw the middle, right? Which is exactly what we want in precision medicine, right? So cancer basically melted away with almost no side effect, right? Unfortunately, we are not quite done yet, right? So there is one superpower by cancer, which shared by all the viruses and other things, right? Which is the natural selection, right? So it can figure out a lot of mutation and essentially dodge the precision, targeted therapy. So then came sort of like really the cutting edge, which is the immunotherapy, right? Because the immune system is basically one health system that also has the blessing of natural selection. So that can basically have the capacity to deal with and catch up in the arm race with the variants and the mutation, right? So, and indeed, you can see some of this blockbuster drug like Keytruda, right? That's a checkpoint inhibitor that basically can work miracle on some of the late stage cancers, right? So that's very, very exciting. And in fact, personally, I think this would be probably the most promising place where eventually we can, tame cancer, right? But unfortunately, today, right, the response rate still hover around 20–30%, even for some of the best drug like Keytruda. So we are, again, far away from being done. So now, when the standard of care doesn't work, right? So you enter the last kind of phase of the life cycle of treatment, which is that the last hope for the patient would be clinical trial, right? So here is Martin Tannenbaum. He's an accomplished AI researcher, but also a very successful e-commerce entrepreneur. Unfortunately, at the peak of his career, he got diagnosis with late-stage melanoma. The standard prognosis, nothing worked, but Marty was able to mobilize his network to find a matching trial for him, which basically saved his life, right? So after this, he completely pivoted his whole career to try to help cancer patients, right? Because he correctly recognized that actually most cancer patients are not as lucky as himself, right? So in fact, even in US, right, it's single-digit percentage of cancer patients were able to find a matching trial, right? But then on the flip side, right? There is a big chunk of trial failure because simply they couldn't find the right patient, right? So that's almost a sort of a super ridiculous situation. And then if you talk to any drug developer, any clinical researcher, they would tell you how horrifying, you know, the whole drug development landscape is, so expensive, so long, and it's totally not sustainable, right? And this problem is particularly exacerbating as we try to do more and more precision health, right? So we basically want to develop more and more drugs, each one actually applicable to a smaller and smaller population. And if each drug costs so much and so long, how can you sustain it, right? So the dream ultimately, obviously, again, I guess I'm preaching to the choir, is that the goal, obviously, the goal is that can we have this continuous data-driven continuous learning health system, right? Where every single kind of like health signal can instantly be incorporated and to be used to optimize the care and also accelerate the discovery, right? So one of the key underpinning is this concept called real-world evidence, right? So the underlying idea is actually very simple, right? So think about every day, right? There are literally billions and billions of data points get collected in the hospitals, right? And documenting the patient journey from diagnosis to treatment to outcome, right? And imagine, think about like even for the best doctor, right? At the beginning of the patient journey, does the doctor know what will actually happen, right? Oftentimes they are not sure, right? They don't necessarily can predict the future, which means that every single patient journey is almost like a mini trial, and every single encounter potentially give you new information, right? Unfortunately, right now, all those trillions and trillions of data points, right? They mostly basically using for diagnosis and clinical practice for billing, then they get locked up in the attic and gathering dust, right? So the holy grail here is that if we can actually unlock the insight that bury into those patient journey, then we can potentially get essentially a population scale free lunch to augment the RCT, right? To augment the clinical trial development process, to actually help patients optimize cares and so forth. So that's kind of like where we are kind of super excited to contribute to, right? So in this world wheel, right? So it's important to realize that actually there are way more than a single constituent, a single stakeholder, right? So the health system is incredibly large and have a lot of different kind of constituents. And so on the bottom side, you can imagine there are lots of data generated that's from the provider, right? But they usually don't have the the resourcing, right, to actually try figure out the infrastructure or the AI to unlock those insights. And at the top, right, you have the stakeholder like farmer and payer. They really keen to have those insights. They can turn those insights actually into drug discovery, into value-based care. But unfortunately, what's missing is the middle, right? So here is actually what we hypothesize is that Gen AI, so if you think about like 5 years ago, 10 years ago, they are very crappy, right? But nowadays, for the first time ever, they may get to a point where they can actually like get good enough, right, to generate sufficient ROI so that they can start to bridging this big bottleneck, right? So you can start to derive enough ROI to actually justify investing in some of the infrastructure, and which allow you to start to unlock bigger investment, right? And bigger ROI, which justify bigger infrastructure and so forth. And hopefully we can create a flywheel to actually start to profoundly transform the precision health. So that's sort of like the armchair philosopher part, right? The question is that how can we get started, right? So obviously, some of you might actually be familiar with the concept about real-world evidence, and you will say, hey, actually, insurance companies have been doing that for decades, right? So there is actually profound differences, right? So people have been milking claim data, claim code for decades, right? Indeed. But if you look at what's in those kind of structured data, right? Structured EMR, structured claim code, they are actually limited to a very thin, superficial slice of the patient information, right? So something some years ago, worked with some Fred Hutch folks, and they actually educated me like some basic stuff like cancer recurrence, right? You do have a ICD code for that, but actually nobody filling them in because it's not involved in billing, right? So So not to mention there are other things like staging, like prior treatment, like lots of 90% of detail, right? All those dark matter actually are not necessarily available in the structured data. So to some extent, the crusade that we are having here is that we're trying to see, can we actually sort of unlock those multimodal dark matters, right? So specifically, here is a DID journey of a cancer patient, right? So every single bar is one clinical notes, right? So there are, the first time I stare at this, like it's almost a heart attack, right? So there are so many different note types, right? And then each note have lots of languages and documenting a lot of details, right? But all those information are unstructured, right? And then on top of that, you will get lots of information, other modality, right? So a cancer patient journey usually started with some non-invasive stuff like maybe X-ray, CT, MRI. Then you got biopsy, you got recession, then you got digital pathology, you got fancy stuff like, spatial transcriptomics and so forth. Each of those, again, trying to tell you something, but each of that has also their inherent limitation, right? And so I kind of liken this sort of some sort of the analogy I read in my childhood, right? So blind folks touching the elephant, right? So only by combining all those modality, you can recapitulate the elephant, right? So from that point of view, right? So this is sort of a nerdy way to think about what's precision health, right? So your input are all those multimodal information, right? But what we are trying to do here is that we are trying to predict what's happening. We want to have a crystal ball about what happened to the patient, right? So would the cancer progress, right? Would the patient respond to the treatment, right? If we can solve this prediction problem with sufficient accuracy, we pretty much will solve precision health, right? Of course, it's not so easy, right? First of all, it's not a single snapshot. The longitudinal information basically are really the meat, right? Also, most of the time you don't even get them, right? So, and they're missing non-randomly. They get lots of, even for the observable one, they get lots of noise, right? So lots of kind of thing can go wrong. So that's kind of like, to some extent, like sort of like kind of like the really the ultimate challenge is essentially this slide, right? So here is actually where we sort of get kind of like the optimistic side of us to start to get hopeful with all this Gen AI progress. Because when you think about what's Gen AI, one of the underlying sort of like concept is really the generative model, right? So, and what's generative model are really good at is by modeling sort of the latent, not observable from conditioning on the observable, right? So essentially it's just a giant conditional probability, right? And also because of that worldview, right? You can also derive, you can actually play with creativity to create a lots of self-supervision heuristic to say, let me hide some of those observable information and try to predict them back, right, from the other observable. And in fact, that basically describes GPT and every single other things right now that's hot, right? So, and if we can do this sufficiently well, then the predicting the future are really just a special case, right? So that's kind of like at a very high level, what we actually really want to do is the following. It's like, let's start from those real world data, those population level free lunch. Let's try to portray a very powerful kind of biomedical foundation model, right? And then the beauty here is that for the first time ever, we start to see that we may have a powerful enough tool to model all those kind of noise and structure and missings and everything, right? But most of all, it's an extremely high dimension, right? And if there is one thing that neural network is good at, is to deal with extremely high dimension data, right? So now, if we are succeeding here, we can learn a generative model that can start to create this, I will loosely call patient embedding, right? So that basically start to capturing what's happening in the patient. And if it gets high fidelity enough, you can basically use that as almost a digital twin, right? And now, if that's happening, what you can do is to start to enable this patient like me reasoning at the population scale, right? So what would be the first thing you would do for a cancer patient, right? the first thing usually is that, find a good doctors, right, to get initial diagnosis. But then the next thing you will do is to find second opinion, third opinion, right? So, and Marty, for example, right, like if he doesn't have such a big network, he, may not be able to find actually the things that actually work for him, right? So, but if we can do this automatically, right, then you actually can snap a finger, right, for every single person, right, every single patient, even low resource patient, right, we can essentially be able to find it sort of like 5 million opinion, right? So here are all the patients that look very similar to the patient in mind and start to interrogate what happened to those patients, right? So what are the treatment people have already tried, right? And how does that work for them, right? And so then you can immediately generate some kind of like ROIs to helping patient, helping physician, right? To improve, kind of like optimize the patient care. And then on the flip side, right? Inevitably, you will also see that, hey, Keytruda, right? 70% doesn't work. Why is that happening, right? So then you can start to compare the non-responder with the exception responders, right? Then you can start to see, okay, how are they differ in actually the representation, and can you trace them back to some of the mechanism, causal mechanism step, right? And which can then you can go back to the clinical researcher and farmer to say, hey, this is why that this tumor is cold, right? So the immunotherapy doesn't work. And this is maybe we can add this combo and turn the tumor to hot, right? So and then so many of you probably familiar with this concept called emerging capability, right? So that basically describes that when you're learning a large language model, when the model is sufficiently high capacity and the pre-training is on sufficiently large data, right? So then you see a phase transition for the model suddenly getting better and better on many of these kind of tasks, right? So now here you can think about there is almost like similar kind of phase transition that we can potentially attain, right? So imagining tomorrow you got GPT-5, right? So it read all the papers, guidelines, and everything, right? Is that sufficient for a patient, right? Arguably, it's still not, right? So the problem is that even if the GPT-5 consume all the known knowledge for now, right? It's still bounded by today's healthcare common sense, right? So if you think back 200 years ago, people doing bloodlettings and other things, right? So you will think, okay, that's so, wrong, right? But maybe in 10 years, we look back, we say, hey, why do we use chemo on this guy, right? So it's totally barbaric, right? So arguably, even today, even the best healthcare, there is so much growth space, right? And that's really the glass ceiling that by just looking at today's the best practice, standard practice, right? But what we could potentially do with all this real world evidence is that we may be able to uncover stuff that even the best doctor don't know about it, right? And that will be kind of like the emerging capability we hopefully can sort of unlock. So I'll quickly pause here to see if there are any questions. So this is kind of like the grand scheme of things, and then we'll probably get to more technical part. All make sense so far? Cool. Okay, so so I will quickly sort of walk through some of the Gen AI kind of like one, right? So there is lots of oh yeah, go ahead. Uh-huh. Yeah, so imagine at the beginning, right? You said, okay, here's my embedding, and here's a similar patient, right? And then I got a group of patients, right? And but then you look at the patient, they are not homogeneous, right? So some of them respond, some of them don't. Then you know your embedding is not perfect, right? Because all you want at the end of the day is that embedding that precisely find the patient that actually could respond, right? So, but from that imperfect starting point, you can start to interrogate what are the parts that separate these two patients that are not captured by the embedding, right? And then number one, you can potentially improve the embedding, which by extension, you can improve the companion diagnosis, right? So if we can improve, for example, response rate from 30% to like 60%, that's amazing saving cost, right? So but then you can, once you can actually start separate them, you can also start to interrogate like what are the actual key features that actually separate them. That's potentially you can lead to discovery. Does that answer your question? Awesome. Any other questions? Cool. So so the hype aside, there is actually a lot of things that Gen AI can actually bring about unlock, right? So and the unlock is not about like, hey, we got 5% more accurate, right? It's actually lead to some of the potentially new paradigm. How do we do things? So I'll give you some example about the universal structuring in a second, which actually is essential for real world evidence, right? Because like when you imagine when you get single cell, when you get genomics and so forth, right? What you still need to do, like those data alone, right, is doesn't tell you too much unless you can start to associate them with the phenotyping information, right? So a lot of those information are basically buried into those nodes and everything. So the first thing that Gen AI can already help you in an 80-20 way is to start to unlock a lot of those valuable information in the patient journey. For those of you who care about interrupts and so forth, the frontier model like GPT-4, right? They not only can translate between literal language, right? They can also like French and English. They can also translate between different ontologies. They understand OMAP, they understand fires and so forth. So in the past, before you do anything, right? You would spend maybe 2 years just try to normalize the schema, right? To do harmonization and all that. Now you may be able to get away from it. First, go scrappy, right? Using the translation capability to actually start getting some ROI before you actually do all those, lengthy harmonization process. Later on, you will see some example where basically the rule of thumb here is that if you can describe something to a reasonably smart and knowledgeable, let's say undergrads and so forth, right? You can most likely ask GPT-4 to do the same things, right? So presumably, if it's all in the text space, so that have actually a major ramification here. You can use GPT-4 as a universal tool to process data, to do all kinds of groundwork that in the past you have to manually do it, right? Or maybe writing some script to do it. Now you can basically delegate to this foundation models. Now, finally, I want to highlight is that you don't want to trust everything the language model tell you. In fact, you probably shouldn't try to trust anything it try to tell you. But you can interrogate the reasoning. And this model actually amazing reasons, right? So you can basically start to leveraging the reasoning capability to essentially enable you to start talking to the data and making sense. So all those are kind of like already very tangible stuff. So let me show you, some of you already familiar with this MapProm paper, literally just a 2-week hackathon and MSR. What we find out is that we basically said, hey, we know that you can basically train a machine learning system, right, to try to pass a medical exam like USMLE exam. But can we not do any training? Can we not do any specific fine tuning, right? Just take the GPT-4 raw, right? Can we out of the box just get it to perform well? Surprisingly, it's very easy to steer the model to do it very well. So this is the first time we can get to 90% accuracy in USMLE exam. It also do super well on a bunch of other biomed NLP tasks. And in a nutshell, basically like people still come to me to say, hey, they want to use a PubMed or BioGPT. I tell them, forget about them, right? Go to GPT-4 because they are very, very good with biomedical text, right? And that sometimes may appear counterintuitive. Now, when you think about it, it's actually very simple, right? So when you go to the public web, right, there are 30 million PubMed papers. There were all the WebMD articles. There were all the podcasts and all those kind of things. So this model already read tons of biomedical text, right? So which means that they are very, very good at understanding the biomedical text. So let me show you some example, right? So for example, one bottleneck to matching clinical trial with patient is that all this elaborate eligibility criteria, right? So, but you can basically just derive a naturally sounding prompt to ask GPT-4. And then GPT-4 can parse this fairly elaborate matching logic for you, right? So you can pretty much like, you don't need to do any manual stuff. Like basically, with a few hours of tweaking, you can basically get GPT-4 to parsing, all the 500,000 trial on the ct.gov for you, right? And then, of course, the more difficult part is actually to understand what happened to the patient, right? So, and that's actually the much more challenging part, right? So in the US alone, every year, 2 million new cancer patients, right? Every single cancer patient right now, like abstractor, probably take 2-3 hours to curate those information. So totally not scalable. But again, you can actually get GPT-4 to pretty much do a lot of this structuring out of the box, right? So essentially, like, for example, one of the most challenging part is like, can you actually look at the notes, right? Can you determine the clinical staging, right? And there is this 600-page book, AJCC staging guideline, right? For every single cancer type, right? Saying, okay, look at this thing, look at that thing. Is it there? Is it there? What's the size, right? If it's less than 3.5 centimeter, what happened, blah, blah, blah. And even worse, right? AJCC guideline, I think right now is like 10th edition. So maybe on December 31st, yeah, this tumor is like 2B. And then on January 1st, it becomes 3A, right? So that's a nightmare for machine learning, right? But for GPT-4, you can literally specify, hey, I want the 8th edition, right? And then you put the staging instruction in the prompt, right? And then you basically tell GPT-4 to read the freaking manual, right? So, and then and when we actually do some preliminary experiment, this actually already performed comparably to some of those supervised model from first generation foundation model where we spend sweat and tears to do. So those are just a couple examples to highlight for you how powerful this frontier model already are doing on text, right? So my number one sort of suggestion is that basically assume in the text domain, you can already do a lot of 80-20 with this kind of model. Unfortunately, it hasn't solved all the things yet, right? Now, once you go beyond text, then this model become ridiculous, right? So you can ask even the best model like, hey, what is a CT scan, right? So early days, they will very confidently draw you a glowing lung, right? These days, they will tell you, hey, I'm actually not sure whether I'm drawing something. So what I give you is a cartoonish picture, right? So at least they understand they are not very good. And so when you look at this landscape, right? So one big problem is that there are so many different modalities, and many of those modalities are not well tackled by the general AI domain, right? So for example, there are the giant medical imaging space, right? So lots of different imaging modality. But when you look at the general web, right? When people work on, you go to CVPRs or something, right? You look at the general computer vision research, many of them are not directly applicable to many of this modality, right? So that's a problem number one. And then also many of you work on the super exciting cutting edge stuff, right? So every day probably there is another startup come up with some new sensoring technology. So how do you keep track, keep at pace with them? So that's the first problem, but actually that's not the biggest problem. The biggest problem is like, even assuming you were able to understand CT, you were able to understand digital pathology and so forth, right? Each of them is like, actually, basically it's like somebody trying to tell you something about the globe, right? But in a distinct language, right? So you have hundreds of language, hundreds of modality, right? And how do you combine all those information? That's fundamentally that elephant problem, right? So, and so essentially my remaining talk will be try to show you some example. We are just having some baby step, right? So far away from being done, but show you some promising early step. So the first example I will show you is sort of like a concrete example where the current computer vision research are far inferior in tackling, which is digital pathology, right? And obviously, why do we care about digital pathology? Many of you are expert about TME, right? Tumor microenvironment. And specifically, right, when you think about why a patient respond to Keytruda and then another doesn't, right? So one of the reason is that in some of the cases, the immune system already figure out there is something wrong here, right? So you already see some of the immune cell like lymphocyte already deep in the tumor territory. That means our immune system already alerted that there is something wrong in that region, but they are just not mobilizing fast enough. That is the sweet spot for checkpoint inhibitor, right? So you basically give them, like federal aid resources, right? And they mobilize and wipe out the cancer. Now, on the other cases, right, cancer is very smart, right? So, I mean, by natural selection, right? So sometimes they actually recruited the immune cell, surrounded them, right? To basically, or send out camouflage signals or whatever, right? So in those cases, like inside the tumor, there are immune cell desert, right? Basically, in that case, when you mobilize the immune system actually don't know where to go, right? So the immune system just then randomly destroys some other normal cell, and so forth. So in some cases, that's actually what happened, right? You have autoimmune overdrive, kill the patient before the cancer, right? So that means that this is actually very important. And then the digital pathology can give us a lot of hints, right? But of course, like this is not something you can just stare at one small patches, right? You need to actually know the global configuration, how the tumor cell, immune cell, normal cell, where do they place, right? So that's actually motivated us to start thinking about how can we do whole slide model? Because a big chunk of digital pathology focusing actually for convenience of computation, focusing on patches or tiles, right? So now theoretically, transformer is your friend, right? So transformer basically work by like you have all the pixel, you basically have all the pixel passing messages, right? So each layer you pass one message, and so you keep passing message. Eventually, you can capture arbitrary complex patterns in the whole whatever, right? So so that's a great thing. That's why transformer become the workhorse of Gen AI. But transformer has one big Achilles heel, right? Which is that if you have to pass messages between every pair of pixel, that means your computation grow quadratically in how many pixels you have, right? And now for small images, that's perfectly fine, right? So we can afford that computation. But for digital pathology, this blow up, right? So one pathologist educated me early on is like, how big is a pathology slide? He said, if you printed it by standard printer resolution, right, it would take up almost a tennis court, right? So that's a very helpful for me to be humbled by the challenges, right? And when you do the math, you will find out that a single standard slide, right, oftentimes could be hundreds of thousands of times larger than your biggest image net, right? So when you then translate with the quadratic, that's totally kill you, right? So you got billions of times, a single slide is billions of compute. So how do we tackle this? So one idea we have explored, there are many directions. I want to preface by saying that this is not the only one, right? And we are also trying some other things, but this one actually proved to be actually a very simple but quite effective approach. This actually originated from speech, right? Which also have a very long context, right? So the idea is called dilated attention. So the idea is actually incredibly simple, right? So think about quadratic. Quadratic is not too bad when it's small, right? So when you start from a local, right, the quadratic isn't a problem. So you can say, okay, in local region, right, we can basically enable the pixel to pass messages with each other. However, when you start to go bigger and bigger, right, that's when the quadratic start to kill you. So then in that case, what you do is that you realize that if I already passing lots of messages locally, then any pixel in that local neighborhood already know a lot about the neighbors and friends, right? So then, which means that you don't have to, if I want to communicate between this block and some further remote block, right? I don't have to get every single person sending messages, right? I can elect some representative to say, hey, you two sync up, right? So make sure you guys are aligned, right? So that's literally the idea, right? So the way that you elect those representative means that you introduce sparsity in the attention, and then you can engineer the sparsity so that it's proportional to how big the block is, which then perfectly cancel out the quadratic, right? So that's basically it, right? So any questions so far? Cool. So of course, actually in practice, like all those modeling thing, I'm a modeling guy, so modeling is fun, but actually in the practice, I think many of you know, right? It took actually a lot more effort to actually get data, to wrangle stakeholders and so forth. In this case, we are super lucky to have fantastic collaborator in Providence and also in UW. We actually spent 2 years in Providence to actually be able to, you know, get the funding, get the data, and get the compute infrastructure, all the kind of mundane things, and then the actual modeling happened in the summer internship, right? So, but quite excited that actually, if you ask me, like even 2 years ago, we will get a Nature paper, I would think you're crazy, right? So as a computer science person, but just speak to the really fortunate time we are in to be able to make contribution. So I will not bore you with many detailed results, but I just want to start by saying that number one, at the grand scheme of things for digital pathology, right now the biggest challenge, one of the biggest challenges, is that we don't have very good evaluation data set. So a lot of the data set right now are inherently tile level, right? So you can see a lot of comparison right now. Actually, a lot of the standard data set, they basically fundamentally, it's almost a chicken and egg, right? So before we cannot compute whole slide, so then everybody do tile, and now because the evaluation is tile, so everybody keep doing tile, right? So our dream would be one day to start to be able to contribute to actually create kind of the next generation evaluation that actually really hinges on whole slide to predict much more challenging things like survival, right, drug response, and so forth. But we are not quite there yet, right? So in this study, we basically obviously start from what everybody's doing, right? So this is like the subtyping. This is already more difficult than like just detecting a cancer, right? So that's the most simple thing to do. But subtyping is like, okay, we know this is ovarian, but what are one of the 6 subtypes? Can you classify that, right? Now, this is relatively easy because number one, the subtype are defined by morphology, right? Number two is that a lot of the information are local. So you can imagine actually tile level already do quite a decent job. Indeed, they are, right? So, but what we are quite excited is that even in this kind of relatively simple task, right? So the having some of those kind of slide perspective actually help it to attain SOTA result. The much more interesting problem that we try is that we basically try to find, okay, what's the hardest problem, absent of the survivals and other things, because those data points, we are still collecting them, but probably take a lot more time to actually get a decent data set. But there are already a decent size of data set where you can get H&E slide and also the mutation status, right? Now, previously, people look at this problem, they often focusing on a very special cancer type and then a very special mutation. So there are a couple well-known pairs, right? Like let's say colon MSI, they are very well-known, right? Very easy, maybe even naked eye can detect the pattern. So for those, actually tile level already can do very well. So here, what we do is that we actually intentionally try to go for the really hard one, which is like, can we find pan-cancer signature, right? So imagine you have all kinds of cancer mixed together, very different morphology, right? Can we still be able to detect some underlying common pattern that correlate with the mutation status, which essentially correlate with the genetic network perturbation, right? The functional perturbations and so forth, right? So obviously not every single mutation, you don't expect every single mutation may manifest in morphology, right? But this is also the fun part, which is like at the beginning of experiment, most of like our pathologist collaborator, they actually don't have a whole idea what are the potential correlation could be, right, beyond a couple of the well-known one. We will actually find that number one, compared to other non-slide level modeling, right, we did a lot more accurate, and the gap actually is much bigger than in the easier tasks like subtyping, right? But also, we actually uncover some genuinely somewhat surprising correlation, like for example, a pan-cancer signature for like KRAS, right? So KRAS, as you know, probably half of the cancer have that, right? And it's obviously not perfect, you know, signal like above 70% AURC, but but our pathologists find very intriguing. So, but I want to also emphasize that, you know, the end goal is not to actually predict mutation, right? Eventually, you will just sequencing the whole damn thing, right? So, but the end goal here is just using it as a proxy to interrogate whether there is some slide level kind of feature that correlate with the functional perturbation, right? I wouldn't dive into the vision language pre-training, but that's also something quite interesting, and it's very easy to do when you have the slide and you have the reports, right? So, actually quite shocked to see how many people actually are downloading it, and couldn't figure out why there are so many people, but yeah, so this is a fun map that I urge my team to find, to generate, and it's quite fun to look at. So, so now if we jump back to a high level, right? So I show you basically one example where we cannot wait for the general AI to solve the modality, right? We have to jump in and leverage the biomedical specific characteristic and then try to tackle the problem, the challenges. But at the grand scheme of things, it's basically just this very standard paradigm, right? You basically start from, let's say, annotated images, right? And then it's just a classic autoencoder paradigm, right? So you have the image, you say, hey, I want to learn an embedding. But I want to basically, how do I learn it? Is by introducing encoder and then the decoder so that I know that I should generate just like the input, right? So you basically create the self-supervision yourself, right? So in this way, it's basically a very powerful paradigm. And then it really just underlying all this kind of single modality self-supervision. And then obviously there are the special case when you can have encoder, decoder the same, and then very powerful in text modality, right? But that's great. Imagine tomorrow, right? We figure out how to encode CT, we figure out how to encode digital pathology and so forth. But that's not the end of the story, right? Because think about it, like I saw a tumor lesion in the CT, right? So my foundation model encode them in some sensible way, right? Globally coherent way. But unfortunately, it will also place the tumor lesion in some arbitrary place in the embedding space, right? And then you have a digital pathology encode the same tumor lesion concept, but it put it in some other different embedding space, right? And then neither of them are also aligned with how, you know, when you see the text, literally quote, right, tumor lesion, what's the embedding for GPT-4, for example, right? So that's kind of like the challenge. And because I'm an NLP guy, I immediately think about the analogy in translation, right? So some of you probably familiar with the Babel Tower, right? So think about the world have hundreds, if not thousands of languages, right? So that's the multimodal challenge we are dealing with right now, right? Now, how do machine translation people do this, right? Initially, it may sound like this problem is unsolvable, right? So for example, you take a language from Africa, right? You take another sub-language in India, right? There may be zero parallel data. So how can you actually train a translation system? So, but commercial machine translation actually solve that. And how do they do it? Is that they introduce a resource-rich language like English. And then they said using that as a bridge, right? So that's the concept about interlingual, right? So basically you said, okay, let me translate from the African language to English. Then I can translate from English to the sub-language in Indian, right? So that's how commercial MT system scale to hundreds of languages in the world, right? So the ambition here is that can we replicate that in the multimodal biomedical space, right? And so then the question is that, okay, what's the interlingual do you want to pick? And also, how do you train those bridging translators, right? So the first hypothesis that we put here is using the text modality as the interlingual, right? So there is many reasons to choose text. One of the big reasons is that we already have this fantastic, you know, frontier model, right? That perfectly capable of understanding biomedical text, right? So that's reason number one. But reason number two is that if you think about all your, you know, favorite like single cell or transcriptomic or whatever, right? Any of the study of those modality often is conducted in natural language, right? Because you need to tell your collaborator how you actually do the experiment, how you report the result, deposit to, I don't know, Geo or whatever, right? So which means that in practice, there is a lot of paper trail. So which means that you often can find easily, there are the modality and the text pairs. And that becomes sort of the free lunch we can leverage, right? So specifically is that we try to build on top of the single modality, the unit model for training as much as possible, right? So we basically do a lot of those GPU burning in those initial steps to train the encoder and decoders, right? And then now in the second stage, we take those free lunch pairs, right? And then we just focusing on training a very lightweight, sort of like adapter layer. You can call it projector, you can call it translation or whatever, right? But the whole point about the adapter layer is simply to take already much reduced dimension space, right, from the encoder. And then I said, hey, you are mapping tumor lesion here, right? I want you to map to actually how the text actually map, right? So you want to basically do some kind of like, I mean, optimal transfer or something, right? To essentially move things around to align with how the text encoding in space, right? So that's kind of like the grand scheme of things. So I will, in the interest of time, I will just skip a bunch of things. So high level, right? Like you obviously need data. So early last year, we basically are probably among the first to show that actually even in the public data, you get a lot, right? So specifically, like you go to your favorite PubMed paper, you got the figure and the caption, right? So that gives you lots of initial training signal. And then super excited that many people build on these ideas. But then this is, if you want to look for one reference to say, hey, how do we actually do this text sensing in the lingua? I will point you to the LavaMed paper, right? So the whole idea, again, is really think about it as not so much about the model itself, right? So any model you publish today probably become obsolete, right? But the general recipe it represents is actually more durable, right? So what we do here is, again, you take the modular approach, right? You build on top of any of the pre-training encoder and decoder, then you focus on training a very simple adapter. Initially, it's just a simple linear layer. Later on, we also try some very small kind of MLPs and so forth, and they are already quite effective. Another big idea that manifests by this is what I alluded to earlier, is how you can use GPT-4 as a universal annotator, right? So again, keep in mind, GPT-4 are very good, especially in the text domain, right? So what can we use it to do? So imagining you have an image and a text pair, right? Of course, GPT-4, I mean, still suck in medical imaging, right? That's the whole point why we try to, learn a better translator and so forth. But it's very good with text. So then let's say we ignore the image for a second, right? And then we said, hey, GPT-4, this is the description about image, right? I want you to create conversation about the image, conditioning on the information described in this description, right? So, and GPT-4 actually, initially quite surprising. Of course, these days we see left and right how people do all this thing, right? It become basically a trope, right? So, but the first time when we work on this, like this is pretty amazing, right? So we are basically going on a limb to think, okay, maybe GPT-4 can do this, and when we actually see the data it generated, we are like, oh my god, it can actually do this. But you can see it actually generate very kind of sensible kind of conversation from the description alone, right? Now, once you have those conversations, essentially the QA pairs, right? You can add back the image. So in this way, then you can basically get the image, question, answer pair, triple, right? From just the original image and text alone. So you can pretty much generate infinite kind of like visual QA data in this way. So once you kind of like test the water in the public domain, of course, the most high value stuff is actually in the patient data, right? So, and actually, when you look at the patient journey, there are even more image text pairs, right? So when you get a radiology image, you usually have a radiology report. When you get a digital pathology slide, you usually get a pathology report. So you can basically use the same recipe And then again, so many other folks follow on this direction. Very exciting. And then you can augment this paradigm by adding an image generator, right? So image decoder, right? So in this way, what can you do? You can basically start to doing virtual imaging, right? So sort of like counterfactual image generation. So for example, imagining you have a patient coming in, right? So 6 months ago, this is a CT scan, right? And then now assuming that you basically try to play counterfactual, right? You said, oh, what if this guy start to develop pneumonia? And what if this guy start to get a cardiomegaly or something, right? How would the CT look like, right? So, and interestingly, by just leveraging readily available patient journey like time series data, we can actually train a pretty decent model that can start to do some of this image generation, right? So of course, it's far from being perfect, but this is something that actually you can start to imagine. If we can start doing this better and better, you can start to basically do what I will loosely call generative diagnostic, right? So you can say, hey, here's a NCCN guideline or whatever, right? So giant decision graph, maybe 28 different tests. Are all the tests actually necessary, right? For every single patient, right? Probably not, right? So there may be very low information gain cases, right? So if there are some modality, some specific journey trajectory, you can actually generate them perfectly. Why do you need to do the test, right? So we are very far from that yet, right? But this is kind of like the potential. The potential. You can also change the image decoder to a mass decoder to do segmentation, right? Because a lot of the time you do need to understand all the biomedical objects, right? Where are they, how precisely, sometimes you even need to measure the volumes, diameters, and so forth. You have to do segmentation. We just got this paper actually accepted by a pretty high impact journal, so probably next month we can publicize that more. But here, what's the exciting thing is that many of you probably familiar with like Meta's great work in SAM, right? So, and then there are MedSAMs and so forth for medical segmentation, for general segmentation, and then medical segmentation. Now, in SAM, one of the limitation is that they are mostly focusing on if you give me a bounding box, right? I can figure out the exact contour of the object, right? But on the other hand, like if you are not kind of like specify where is the object, then the SAM basically like could start having trouble. And then also in biomedicine, right? You also sometimes have like, even you specify the bounding box, there could be very complex stuff inside, right? There could be multiple object, irregular shapes, and so forth. And those are the kind of like the Achilles heel for this kind of like more bounding box centric kind of segmentation approach. And the fundamental reason is that in SAM, they ignore the object information, right? Mostly, right? So like the text learning is afterthought, right? If you look at the original SAM paper. So here, what we try to do is we try to put object recognition, detection, and segmentation all in a single training step. And we try to learning the segmentation along with the object model, right? So because for individual object, you actually have some default idea about how that object will look like, right? So you can using that, you can encode those information and so forth. So anyway, I would just conclude by saying that number one, there are many modalities that need to be done, right? So excited to have some of the single cell conversation today, and so much to pick you guys' brain. Maybe counterintuitively, right? There is also structured EMR is also a very distinct modality, right? So there are lots of those lab tests and so forth, the time series and so forth. That's actually not easily handled by any of the existing tools, right? So like the language model don't handle them very well. And so that's actually a very interesting thing. And I wouldn't kind of belabor some of the things, but I would just highlight there is this kind of multidisciplinary, multi-model tumor board that is a very interesting kind of use case to unify a lot of this kind of, to ground a lot of this kind of application. So ultimately, what do we want is like, once we learn the patient embedding, we want to embed the whole world, right? So let's embed the patient, but also let's embed the drug, right? Let's embed trials and everything, right? So then maybe drug discovery can become more and more kind of scalable to this high dimension information, right? Because then the embedding already capture a lot of information, right? So, and one concrete case obviously is clinical trial matching, right? So actually it turns out that today we can already do 80-20 of this, right? The really thing that drives me nuts is that we already have the technology here, right? So how can we actually get that to enable all those 97% of cancer patients who couldn't find trial, or hopefully we don't have a cancer trial fail because they couldn't find patient, right? So we already got some early promising success, right? So we work with Providence and they have started using our actually very crappy research system, but they already find very useful in 3 test sites. So sort of like hopefully can scale. But here is just an appetizer, right? Imagine if you can do clinical trial matching, right? And what it gives you is basically a key to essentially doing virtual hypothesis generation and testing, right? So you can basically snap a finger, specify what your research hypothesis, right? You can get a virtual treatment and control arm, right? So and now you can basically start play with a lot of counterfactual for free, right? And so here just a baby step proof point. Working with our Providence folks, right? We basically like taking some of the marquee lung cancer trial. On the left-hand side, we basically look at their published hazard ratio, right? So that's kind of like the one number you spend those $100 million to try to get, right? So, and then on the right-hand side, those are basically we look at the real world data from Providence, and then we try to essentially simulate the trial, right? So it's actually quite promising to start to see that like this one is actually the original Keytruda trial, right? So so there were definitely some signal there, right? Now here, of course, I want to preface by saying that, you know, obviously the single biggest Achilles heel for RWE is the causal the confounders, right? And in fact, this is sort of like a preliminary study to show you like if you don't do any causal correction, right? So this bar basically signifies what if you look at the real world data, you got a hazard ratio, you subtract that from the published hazard ratio. So this is the distance, right, between the hazard ratio. Now, if you don't do causal correction versus if you do, like we are not even doing any fancy thing like state-of-the-art thing like you guys do. We're just doing some basic propensities and other things, right? And it already have a very marked kind of like correction effect. So I can't help but by actually imagine if I can pick more of you guys' brain. So let me just, I know we are over time, so apology, but let me end it on a sort of sobering note, right? So this is one de-identified journey for a patient. It started having CT chest rate, right? Then they worry about metastasis, so they do a PET, they do an MRI, right? So and then fortunately at that time they don't see any metastasis, right? So then they basically using chest rate to help doing you know deliver the chemos and everything, right? So so that's in February. And then after 8 months, right? So like for a while the patient seemed to be, you know, doing fine. After 8 months, right? So patients start getting some problem, come back, right? Doing a bunch of additional modalities, and then unfortunately find the metastasis in the liver, and then confirm that, right? And then within a month, the patient died, right? So if you think about it, right, that's actually heartbreaking for actually many cases today, right? So you got actually many signals potentially buried on the left-hand side, right? But we don't know how to read them to some extent, right? So maybe this kind of case is not savable, but also it's also possible it could be savable, but we don't know how to read the thing, right? So that basically get back to the bigger picture, right? So I would say today, on the left-hand side, that's where Gen AI already make a lot of difference, right? So, and also can make much bigger difference, right? If we can sort out as a society, figure out the infrastructure, figure out the business model, and figure out the regulation and everything, we can already do a ton on the left-hand side, right? So those are the places where the human expert can perfectly do it, right? Like let's say, hey, read 200 notes, right, to figure out what is the health status for the patient, right? So any abstractor can do it perfectly well. It's just super boring, super repetitive, right? Super time consuming, right? That's actually a sweet spot for AI today, right? It's like the AI can basically come through it in 1 millisecond and say, oh, here are 5 needles, candidate needles. Tell me which one you like, right? So, and to some extent, that's basically like you just follow today's guideline, right? You are bounded by today's healthcare common sense, but you can already do a ton. On the right-hand side, that's when, for example, when you can discover new biomarker, right, from the H&E slide to predict, hot versus cold tumor and so forth, right? No human expert can assimilate, 8 billion patients data point, read all the literatures and everything to get all this stuff together, right? And also today, if you talk to many of the folks who work on the guidelines, right, particularly, the biggest pain point for them is they couldn't kind of like revise them fast enough, right? So there are tons of evidence. Actually, every day there is a lot of evidence and signal generated every day. They could only get the tiny narrow slice of the information and then take years to actually evolve the guideline, right? So and can we do this much faster, right? And discover something that even the best expert cannot do. So I do want to end by highlighting my team. These days, I'm mostly just doing PowerPoints. And also more importantly is that also all our collaborators, right? So who without whom we can't do any of this. Thanks.
So great, thanks. Yeah,
This was an inspiring talk. I wanted to ask you, you mentioned something briefly about sort of missing data and this informative missing. And so it was somewhat clear in the context of this patient case that you showed at the end, that sort of there's this period in the middle that there's no data for this patient, as you mentioned, by guidelines, et cetera, et cetera. And sort of there are factors that sort of basically are confounding what's observed and what's missing. But in addition to that, sort of what the clinicians see as needed is important in sort of what data are observed over time for each patient. So what are your thoughts on sort of how to tackle that challenge? Because it seems like that's the key in order to go from, yes, ChatGPT-4 is great for text. Yes, we can push it to even do maybe imaging, etc. To going to that stage that sort of now it becomes clinically relevant.
I want to make sure I talk to the mic, but that's such a fascinating question that I think we can immediately brainstorm for another, few hours. But I want to just quickly tee up a few angles, right? So the first super simple layer of missingness is simply like the information are there, but they're in unstructured form that currently are not accessible, right? So that's the super sweet spot, right? Like here are the cancer recurrence in the notes, right? So and so that can already get out of the way. Then there are sort of the missingness in terms of like today maybe we are not optimizing the guideline and the diagnostic in the most optimal way, right? So then we are not actually testing the right thing, or maybe we are testing a lot of irrelevant things, right? So that's actually where I think there is a lot of growth space by learning from the real world data, right? And the hope here is that there are enough diversity in the practice that you could start to see some almost semi-natural experiment where you can start to see the difference in the practice and maybe actually lead to new insights and so forth, right? Like one of the common case that my physician friends educated me about is oftentimes like the most simple diagnosis everybody can do, right? So I mean, not me, but every competent doctor can do. But it's really when you have some very rare long tail stuff, right? That's when the experience today kicking, right? Now imagining if we arm the AI brain with the experience of 8 billion patients with that, right? So that's another kind of, I would say, loosely connected to missingness. Is like we don't even know where to look, right? So it's one example that physician friend tell me is that like there is this fever, whatever, right? So and I wouldn't try to butcher the disease or whatever, but the common diagnosis is something, but he suspect there is another thing. So he ordered some kind of like test, and turns out that test confirmed it is the rare thing that he would order. But 99% of other doctors would not order that test. And so that's another kind of missing. And that is, I would say, almost like epidemiology kind of missingness, right? And then there are also the kind of interesting missingness, which is like almost like the uncertainty principle of measurement, right? So like you do H&E, you burn the tissue, so you cannot measure spatial transcriptomic, right? So, but on that front, I think number one is that how do we do some smartness and the data to try to, be able to, again, probably we need some sort of interlingua to translate between them, because you never get those two together, right? But how do you do it? And then, but also sensor technology always evolve, right? So just the other day, people tell me, oh, now I can actually do H&E and spatial transcriptomic together, right? So then, so I think there is that kind of missingness, right? And then obviously there are missingness because of the cost and other things, right? So just super fascinating. Yeah. Does that help?
It does. I mean,
Okay.
yeah, it does. I think it's complicated. I mean, because as you said, sort of, I mean, yes, there's variability in practices, but then there are these guidelines, right? That sort of what insurance dictates, what costs.
Oh yeah. Oh, insurance.
So those are outside of that. I mean, those
Absolutely.
are things that sort of I'm thinking about. That sort of might
Yeah. But also, right, everybody, obviously, have angst about like coding and everything, but and reimbursement models and so forth. My view on that is that the real world evidence actually is one really rich source of things that you can derive signal to then basically, because right now we are not sure about the science, right? Like which way to go, right? So I talked to some payer, I said, why would a knee surgery, right? 10x difference like within a block, right? So well, they said, oh, right, like you don't know actually, right? This one probably much better or something. But with RWE, you can get much more ambiguous signal, which then can hopefully then turn that back to the society to figure out, right? But right now, society don't have enough input to make those judicial decisions. Hey, Karen.
Great, very inspiring talk. So I do have a question about, say, I mean, there are, say, ChatGPT, like GPT-4 that's basically uses a lot of data in order to train, right? And then you do have, HR, which is also, it is large scale, but it is not that many, patients involved. And then there are a lot of small studies that they have, just like a few hundred people, but then you have a lot of measurements and very structured measurements. And this how you think you can kind of, learn combining all those.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite questions. Obviously, it's like I have been asked before. So, and I just having some conversation with my Providence collaborator just yesterday about exactly this problem. So I think first I want to make sure I understand your question, right? So your question is like, there are obviously the big data regime, right? So we just run on the GPU to do the pre-training. There are the kind of like the reasonable training regime, your thousands or tens of thousands example where you can do normal supervised learning. But what if you have a very small data regime when you only have very few example, but very high dimension, which is a classic case of you can overfit like crazy, right? So is that kind of like your question or?
Yeah, I guess when I'm kind of, it's related, but then what I feel is like the EHR have a lot of people, but then you also have a lot of missingness and things like that.
Sure.
And you might,
Sure.
So, but then for more traditional studies, you do have like, planned measurements, you have very good locating,
Sure.
complete data, but
Sure.
then usually it's like small samples.
Right.
So I guess there are sort of different.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah. There are basically different paradigm, right? So, well, partially we choose cancer as a beachhead disease area is that number one, there is so many disruption happening, right? But also number two is that cancer is a fundamentally high touch disease where hospital already have lots of records, right? So, but exactly like you said, even there, you have a lot of missing stuff, right? Like RECIST criteria, when pharma run trial, they hire radiology to do that, but most of the practice you don't do that, right? So that's sort of like a large scale, but have a lot of missing needs versus like you run clinical trial, which have very complete data, but then very high quality structured data, but then very limited, right? And then you may also have some of the like Michael Snyder, right? Like N of one kind of case, right? Like a single person but measure every damn thing, right? So I think it's very interesting to think about all those three paradigm. And I almost tempted to, I'm not a Bayesian fundamentalist to first disclaimer, but I think there is some sort of like fundamental idea about, you know, kind of like you can have almost some sort of hierarchical modeling here, right? So you can imagine there are different kind of data, you use them to learn different kind of patterns, right? So you can almost imagine the EHR is the broadest data. So you probably always start from it. You always start from the biggest scale one, right? Now, the beauty for that is that you probably sufficiently reduce the dimension. So now when you do the second stage, right? When you maybe using clinical trial, you are not starting from scratch. You are starting from a much better kind of like dimension space. And now on top of that, maybe you can start to interpret the N of one much more intelligently, right? In fact, if you look at the whole GPT-4, how they train, if you look at how we train the unit model, then the bimodal, right? It's the same curriculum learning, right? Like GPT-4 start from just literally predict next token, right? For tens of trillions of token. But after you learn that, it's still quite have lots of rough edges, right? Then you do maybe some supervised fine tuning, right? So that's only tens of thousands, and then you go from there.
Yeah, thanks for the fascinating talk and discussion. I think we're over time, so I want to end the seminar and then keep the questions to the after the seminar. And let's thank again.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.